right now. All right, so keeping going with the access check, next on the slide, we've got participation. So you can participate in this workshop however is most comfortable for you. We'll be breaking multiple times for questions throughout the course of the workshop, sort of after every major section. And during those breaks, if you want to ask a question out loud, I just ask that you use the Zoom raise hand feature to indicate that you want to ask a question. That can be found in the reactions tab in your Zoom menu bar. If you'd prefer to use the chat, you can also just type your questions in the chat. And when we go for those breaks, I will read out any questions that have been asked in the chat. Just something to note, because we are recording, if you do ask a question out loud, you are going to be on that recording. If asking questions out loud is the best option for you, but you don't want to be recorded, you can either let me know in the chat during the workshop or shoot me an email afterwards and we'll cut you out of the recording, no questions asked. In terms of your camera in general, your camera can be on or off, whatever you prefer, whatever is most comfortable for you. I'm not going to ask you to explain why your camera's off. If you want it to be off, whatever you want to do. If you need to eat or fidget, or you got a kid or a pet you got to take care of, do whatever you need to do. All modes of engagement are welcome here. And you should have received in a reminder email today, both the outline for today's workshop and a copy of the slides. So if it is best for you to follow along with either of those documents while I'm talking today, please do so. And last on this slide for our access check is image descriptions. So as you heard me do when I introduced myself at the top of the workshop, I gave a quick visual description of myself. And that's just so that anybody who can't see me for whatever reason knows what I look like. I'll ask that if you are speaking out loud during today's workshop, that you provide a description for yourself too, before you start talking. That can be, as short or as long as you want it to be. If you don't want to disclose your age, your race, anything like that, you don't have to. Just describe yourself visually however you want to describe yourself. In addition to that, I will be describing any images that appear on my slides throughout the course of the workshop, and any text that's on my slides will also be read out loud. So that is our access check. Before I move forward, does anybody have any needs that haven't been met, or any questions about that access check that I can answer now? Magali, to your question in the chat, are subtitles captured if the recording team member activates the recording feature? Yes, they are. And also something that I did not mention is that you can also view and save the transcript of this workshop yourself if that's interesting to you. You can click, again, the CC button on your bottom Zoom menu and then click View Transcript, and you'll see an option to save the full transcript, which, if you want to, you are welcome to do that. All right, moving right along. Oh, Magali, I see your hand raised. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah. One more question. Hi, I'm Magali. I have a blue background behind me, a picture from Iceland, Blue Lagoon, so it makes me happy. And I'm female, and I'm wearing a dark blue shirt. And regarding the subtitles, do they appear if you're sharing this via Facebook or YouTube, or is it only available if you're simply in a Zoom event? Is it visible for the viewer in a streaming platform?
They would also be visible if you were streaming from Zoom to another platform, and we are going to get a lot more into captions later on today. So I'll hold off on talking more about that for now.
I'm giving you a great thumbs up. Thank you.
All right. So keep those questions coming. We're going to move along. and I am going to offer up a land acknowledgement before we get started. So I've got the text of the land acknowledgement on my screen, but again, I am also going to read it out loud. So a land acknowledgement is a practice of Art New York's that we do before all of our public gatherings, just as a way, even though we're not all sharing the same land right now, just as a way of acknowledging the land that we are on. And so I'll be acknowledging land from the 5 boroughs of New York City, because that is where Art New York's membership is located. But if you are currently outside of New York, you can go to a website called native-land.ca to learn about whose land you are on. So I would like to take this moment to acknowledge that wherever we are currently located on Turtle Island, otherwise known as North America, we are on occupied territory. Art New York's membership in the 5 boroughs of New York City operates on the unceded ancestral land of the Lenape, Wappinger, Canarsie, Rockaway, and Matinacock communities. I want to honor and celebrate all of these Indigenous communities, their elders past and present, as well as future generations. And I also want to take this time to acknowledge that after there was stolen land, there were stolen people. And I want to honor the generations of displaced and enslaved people that built and continue to build the country that we occupy today. And as we go into today's conversation, I also want to acknowledge the intrinsic link between the fight for disability justice and the fights for anti-colonialism and Indigenous sovereignty. Around the world, Indigenous people have disproportionately higher rates of disability than their colonizers and have significantly less access to support and accommodations. Additionally, our modern understanding and treatment of disability is largely based in colonization and white supremacy. Disability justice work cannot exist without decolonization, climate justice, economic justice, and racial justice. And I hope we can keep that interconnection in mind throughout our time together today. Thank you for sitting with me for that. So let's move along. Oops, one slide too far. Okay, so here we are, understanding accessibility for virtual theater. On my slide, I've got an image of a laptop and I've got the title of the workshop, and underneath it, it says Kirsten Sweeney, Art New York. That is me. So I am here teaching this workshop today, both as an access professional, as someone who works in accessibility through my job at Art New York. Obviously, I manage all of our external access programs, but then I also work to make sure that Art New York's internal practices are as accessible as possible. And then I'm also here as a disabled person myself. So I am autistic, and that absolutely impacts the ways that I navigate virtual space, the ways that I navigate theater, and the ways that I navigate virtual theater. So when it's relevant for me to sort of talk about my own personal experiences, I'll do that as well. But just so you all sort of have an idea of where I'm coming from, that's where I'm coming from. All right, moving right along to our agenda for today. So I've got the agenda listed on the screen next to an image of a clock. And our agenda today, we've already checked the first thing off of our agenda. We've done our access check and our introduction. So after that, we're going to move into a brief overview of some of the differences when we're thinking about accessibility in terms of in-person versus virtual theater. We're going to talk about what you need to think about when choosing a platform and platform accessibility in the virtual space. We're going to talk about accessibility of pre-show materials, and then we're going to take a break because I think breaks are very important. It'll probably be around 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how quickly we move through the first part of this workshop. And then we're going to spend pretty much the whole second half of this workshop talking about performance accessibility and the various different types of accommodations you can offer in your actual virtual performances. And then we'll end with just sort of an open discussion Q&A to answer any questions that weren't answered during the workshop. As I said at the top, we're going to be breaking for questions frequently throughout these various sections, so you should have plenty of opportunities to ask whatever you need to ask. I also just want to note that this this workshop is a broad strokes workshop. We're not going to go super deep into any sort of specific accommodations today because we only have 2 hours and we just simply don't have the time. The goal for this workshop is to give you a snapshot of all of your different options. And then I hope that you can go forward from this workshop, being able to choose some of those options and dive deeper into them yourselves and through future Art New York workshops. And noting future Art New York workshops, you are going to get a workshop evaluation form sent to you in your email tomorrow after this workshop. And I highly, highly ask you to please fill that out to let me know what you do want us to dive deeper on in future Art New York workshops. Because again, like I said, we're going to keep things pretty high level today. And additionally, this workshop is brand new. This is the first time I'm teaching it. So those evaluation forms will be really, really helpful for me in thinking about future iterations of this. And I promise I can take constructive criticism. So please, please do let me know what you think about how this workshop goes for you. All right. So let's move along and talk a little bit about accessibility for in-person versus virtual theater. So for in-person theater, I've gotten listed on my slide just some of the sort of major things that you would be thinking about. Of course, you would be thinking about the accessibility of the venue itself, of where you're hosting your performance. You would want to make sure that your pre-show materials were accessible. You might have open or closed captioning at a performance. You might have ASL interpretation or audio description. You might do relaxed performances, and you might even do touch tours. And if you don't know what any of that means, don't worry, we're going to get into it. But let's look at what's sort of different when we're thinking about virtual theater. And the list is almost exactly the same. So instead of the accessibility of your venue, you're thinking about the accessibility of your platform. And then at the last thing on this list is touch tours, which necessarily involve touch, which obviously doesn't exist in the virtual space. So I've listed touch tours in quotation marks, and we'll get into what that means later in the workshop. But otherwise, every other thing that you're thinking about in terms of accessibility, your pre-show materials, captioning, ASL interpretation, audio description, relaxed performances, all of that can also happen in the virtual space. It just requires a different approach. And we are going to get into what that approach is. So in general, when you're thinking about accessibility, whether it's virtual, in person, wherever it is, there are two major things that you want to keep in mind, and I hope that you'll keep in mind throughout this workshop today. And those two things are information and participation. So at the end of the day, this is what goes into making something accessible. So information, do people have all of the information that they need to access your event? And is that information available in multiple formats? And then for participation, you want to ask yourself, can all people participate in your event? And are there multiple flexible modes of participation available? So throughout this workshop, as I'm going through various different types of accommodations that you can provide, all of them are going to be responding to one of these two needs. They're either going to be responding to access of information or access of participation. And with that said, let's start with the sort of first thing you want to think about when thinking about accessibility in virtual theater, and that is accessibility of your platforms. So on my screen, I've got the logos for what I've seen as sort of the big three in terms of what people are using to make virtual theater. And that is Zoom, Facebook Live, and YouTube/YouTube Live. I know that there are many, many, many more platforms out there than these three that you all may be using. We're not going to dive super deep in those today. We, again, just don't have the time, but I will provide you some tips on what to look for, no matter what platform you're using. But to give a brief overview of accessibility on these three platforms. So for Zoom, Zoom is, in my knowledge and from what I've heard from other folks, the most accessible option out there. So if you've been using Zoom for your virtual theater, congratulations, you're already taking a step in the right direction. They obviously have captioning capabilities. We're using that today. And what's great about Zoom is they have capabilities for both automated captions, which is what we're using, and for CART, or human generated captions. And we're going to get into more the differences about those later, but what's important to know is that they support both types of captions. Zoom also has, as I mentioned earlier, the ability to save the transcript of an event if you do have the captions turned on. So that is a great feature, and transcripts can be really accessible for different folks. So it's just a nice option to have. Something else that's been really good about Zoom in terms of accessibility is that they seem to listen to people. They haven't always been perfect in their accessibility. Still not perfect, but they seem to be listening to folks who have concerns about their accessibility. And an example of that is with their chat used to be super inaccessible to folks who used screen readers, in that every single time a message popped up in the Zoom chat, it would be automatically read out by a person's screen reader, which you can imagine would be really distracting if someone's trying to listen to a Zoom event while simultaneously getting constant chat messages streaming into their ears. And so Zoom heard people's concerns and fixed that issue, and now the chat functions in a different way that's more accessible. This automated captioning feature on Zoom is also fairly new. And so that is another example of them sort of listening to folks' concerns in terms of accessibility. One other thing that I really like about Zoom, and this is less relevant to sort of straightforward performances, but more relevant if you're doing something a bit more interactive, is their ability to have nonverbal reactions, which you can click in the reactions tab. In addition to the raise hand button, they've got, speed up, slow down, I need a break, all of these different things. And for someone like me who's autistic, or for anybody who can't or doesn't feel comfortable speaking in large groups, nonverbal reactions are just a really great way when we're thinking about participation and how we can make sure that everybody's able to participate. That's just sort of another participation option that Zoom offers. That is really great. So in terms of Facebook, we're talking about Facebook Live. Facebook Live also allows for both automated captioning and real-time human-generated captioning, which is really great. And one benefit that Facebook does have over Zoom as a platform is that it's just more familiar to folks. I would say that there are more people out there who have a Facebook account who know how to use Facebook than those who know how to use Zoom, especially if your audience tends to skew a bit older. It's generally the case that older folks find Facebook a more accessible and more familiar platform. Similarly, YouTube is a more widely used, more familiar platform, which helps in terms of access. Unfortunately, YouTube really is lacking in the captioning department. When we're talking about YouTube Live, they only have capability for automated captioning. Human-generated captions are not. You can't do them straight on YouTube Live. And for whatever reason, they only make automated captions available for channels with over 10,000 subscribers, which is very strange. So if you're streaming on YouTube Live, you're going to want to stream, for example, from Zoom to YouTube or from some other platform that does enable captioning so that you can use it that way. For pre-recorded videos, if you're just uploading videos to YouTube, their captioning is fine. They actually have a great sort of easy to use captioning backend for you to add your own captions to YouTube. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So that's sort of the basic overview of those three platforms. All of them are generally accessible. I would say from my perspective that Zoom is the most accessible. If you are using a platform other than these three, what you're going to want to do is you're going to go to that company's website and dig around, find their accessibility page if they have one. Read what they have to say about their platform accessibility, and if they're even thinking about it at all. And what I would also recommend you do, whether or not they have an accessibility page on their website, is find a contact for that company and contact them with this question. Does your platform conform to the WCAG 2.1 standards of web accessibility? So what the hell is WCAG? WCAG stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and they are sort of a single shared standard for web accessibility. It's a checklist essentially of different things that websites technically are legally required to adhere to. Often they don't, and that's where lawsuits come into play. But you're going to want to ask them if they conform to WCAG, and if they don't, what their plan is for achieving compliance. And then you can sort of make your own determination based on what they say if you want to work with that platform. So I say you want to ask them about WCAG 2.1 because that is the most current version of these guidelines. It was released in 2018. But just about 2 weeks ago, they released the first draft of WCAG 3, which is a really it's an overhaul of the guidelines. So there's going to be some big changes in the next few years when those guidelines are finalized. But for now, you don't worry about that. But just a fun fact in case you want to know. Okay, let me stop here. Do folks have questions about platform accessibility or web accessibility in general? And I know there is one question in the chat, so I'm going to start there while other folks think of questions. So Magali asks, how do we activate these nonverbal reaction options? My Zoom account doesn't have it. So that might just mean that you haven't updated your Zoom in a while. If you don't have a reactions tab on your Zoom menu bar, you might find that instead in your participants tab at the bottom of the participants list. Yes, I should have clarified that. But the most updated version of Zoom has the reactions in their own separate tab. Yes, all right. Any other questions from anybody about platform accessibility? All right, moving right along, we are going to talk about your pre-show materials. So what do I mean when I'm talking about pre-show materials? I'm talking about your website, all of the information about your performance that lives on your website. I'm talking about any emails that you're sending to your audience about your performance. I'm talking about any graphics that are created about your show. And I'm talking about if you're doing a virtual program for the show. Akia, to answer your question in the chat, yes, these slides will be available after the workshop. I'll also be sending around a more in-depth sort of resource guide that will contain sort of further reading on all of the things that I'm talking about today. So on the slide, I've just got a little icon that indicates website, email, graphics, and program. And so we're talking about those four things, and we're talking about basically any information that you're providing in advance of your performance to your audience. So what do you need to do to make these things accessible? The first thing is to keep WCAG in mind, and this is not a web accessibility workshop, so I'm not going super deep into what all of the WCAG guidelines are, but I've listed sort of a main four that are easy easier to accomplish yourself. So number one thing you want to keep in mind with all of your pre-show materials is having good color contrast. So in my presentation today, all of my slides are either dark text on a light background, like the slide we're looking at now, or light text on a dark background. And in all of those cases, the text and the background are completely different colors. So for example, here we've got dark blue text on a light pink background. That is good color contrast, which means that folks who are low vision or are colorblind or otherwise struggle with their vision in some way can most likely access this slide. And there are really easy tools that you can use online to check the contrast of your colors and your various materials. And again, in that resource guide that I alluded to, I will be sending you some tools that you can use for that. Another thing that you want to keep in mind is using sans serif font whenever possible. And so sans serif font is like the font that I'm using in this presentation. It doesn't have serifs, which are the little, if you think of like Times New Roman font, for example, that's a serif font where they have the little like decorative lines on the ends of each of the letters. Sans serif fonts are easier to read, again, for people who are low vision, for folks who are dyslexic or otherwise have different learning disabilities. In general, sans serif fonts are just more accessible. And personally, I think they look better anyway. So whenever possible, use sans serif. Large print is also really important. So again, in my presentation today, I think the smallest typeface that I've used is maybe 25 point, maybe even 30. And that is like legally considered large print by the WCAG guidelines. I also understand that that's quite big and that depending on the format of your materials, you might not be able to like make that the standard for your materials. So if you can't do large print in your sort of regular program, it's great to have like an alternative large print version of your program available for folks to download if they want that. And last is you want to make sure that any images that are included in your program or anything like that have alt text. Alt text is alternative text, and it is exactly what it sounds like. It's the text alternative for an image so that somebody who's using a screen reader who can't see your images can get the information of what that image is. So for example, if I go back to my previous slide and we look at this last icon I have here, the icon I have for program, the alt text for that image might be something like a folded yellow pamphlet with writing and a picture of a mountain on it. And that is just a brief description that describes what that image is. And again, I'm going to provide several resources for you that go a little bit more in depth onto how to write alt text and some things that you might want to consider. So in addition to those sort of web accessibility guidelines, some other things you might want to consider providing in your pre-show materials are content notes or content warnings. You might also have heard these called trigger warnings. But basically, it's important to provide clear information on your website and your program, whatever that might be, about any information that might be potentially triggering to your audience. And that means, of course, things that could be emotionally triggering, which might be what you think about when you hear trigger warning, but also things that could be physically triggering, such as loud noises, gunshots, bright or flashing lights, intense dizzying movement, anything that could be harmful to somebody who has a seizure disorder, to someone who is neurodivergent and can't handle loud noises, anything like that. Again, I will provide resources that contain a list of different things you might want to think about, but it's generally good practice to provide these. My next bullet point on here is a bit of a pie in the sky thing, because I understand that this is very often not possible. But if you find yourself in a position to be able to provide the script in advance, provide that to your audience, that is always helpful for folks, again, who are neurodivergent or have anxiety or otherwise like to sort of know what's coming. And then also, some folks who are deaf or hard of hearing might prefer to read along with the script while the performance is going on. So that's like a nice thing that I understand is often not possible. If that's not possible, you're able to instead provide a plot summary, definitely do that again, to give people the option to find out what's coming before it happens. And you can, link the plot summary on a separate page. So you're not like giving people spoilers who don't want to receive spoilers, but again, thinking about that information piece of access and giving folks the option to have that information if they need it. Of course, any video content that you're producing about your show must be captioned. And you should also provide a transcript for that video as well, because for some folks, transcripts are actually more accessible than captions. And if you have any like audio only content about your show, a radio spot or podcast episode, or I don't know what you would be doing, but provide a transcript for that as well. You should provide information about using the platform. Don't assume that everybody knows how to use Zoom or that everybody knows how to use whatever platform you're presenting your performance on. So if you have the time to create a sort of how-to guide that's specific to your production, that's great. If that's not possible, at the very least, link people to that platform's own help page or whatever, so that they know where they can go to find information about how to use the platform if they're not familiar with it. And it's really important on all of your materials to include a point of contact for all accessibility information and requests, so that people know if they have needs, they have a real person who they can speak to fulfill those needs. So this should not be just like an info@ email address. This should be a real person with their own email address and also a phone number. So folks have multiple options of how they can contact this person. And the last type of pre-show material that I want to talk about, which in my mind is the most important one, again, as an autistic person, I'm a bit biased, but a visual story, I think, is one of the greatest pieces of pre-show accessibility that you can provide. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what a visual story is. So this, you might have heard this called a social story, a social narrative, a visual guide. There are a million different names for it. But basically what it is a step-by-step guide that uses both plain language and images to prepare readers for what to expect from a certain activity, such as attending a performance. So in addition to the definition of visual story on my slide here, I have a little price tag icon and it says $0 on it. So throughout this presentation, when I'm talking about different access accommodations, whenever possible, I'm going to include a price tag to let you know how much or how little that thing will cost you, because I understand that that is a question that goes into making these decisions, and I want, whenever possible, to inform you of what you can expect in terms of cost. The great thing about visual stories, they don't cost anything. All you have to invest is some staff time in making it. So what sorts of things do you put in a visual story? A lot of the same things that I already talked about. So you want to include a step-by-step guide of how to use the platform and how to access the performance. And in this case, you don't just want to link to the platform's help page. You really want to make this guide for yourself in a way that's specific to how people will access your performance. Screenshots are your friends. Do a little test run yourself of how somebody might access your performance. Take screenshots of every step of the way, turn that into a visual guide or a story. But make sure those screenshots have alt text so that somebody using a screen reader can also access your visual story. You want to include a step-by-step guide of how to reserve a ticket. Definitely any content notes or warnings should go in this guide. It's generally good practice to include a cast of characters with pictures and descriptions. A plot summary usually also goes in here, maybe with sort of screenshots of different scenes of the play, so that folks can, again, the goal of this is to give people to let people know what they're getting themselves into. But it's also always good to include spoiler alerts before important plot points so that people can opt in or opt out of receiving that information. And again, you always want to include a point of contact for where people can go for questions or assistance. All right, so I'm going to stop talking for a second and let's open it up for questions again, specifically questions about pre-show materials. And I have a couple of private questions in the chat that I'm just going to answer out loud first. So what is the difference between automated and human-generated captions? We are going to talk about that at length later in the workshop, so I'm going to hold off on that question. I promise we will get to that. I also have a question about, will you have access to the recording of this workshop? Yes, we will. So it'll take a little bit of time just to edit the captions on the recording, because even though we have automated captions, they're not 100% accurate. So we'll edit them, make them accurate, and then send the recording out to you all. All right. So any questions about pre-show materials, about visual stories, anything that I just talked about? All right. So moving along. So next I am going to show you all an example of what I think is just a really exemplary display of what good pre-show accessibility looks like. And this is, so on my slide, so I'm going to be talking about a performance of Samuel Beckett's Not I, which was performed by Jess Tom of Tourette's Hero. And so Jess is a performer from the UK, and she has Tourette's, and she founded this organization, Tourette's Hero, that does arts work and advocacy work around access and disability. And so this is an in-person performance, almost exactly a year ago as part of the Public's Under the Radar Festival. She did this performance of Not I. And the performance itself was also incredibly accessible. I'm not going to talk about that today, but I do want to show what the website looked like in terms of pre-show materials. And just on my slide, I've got an image of Jess. She's a white woman with short curly brown hair and sort of buzzed on the sides. She's wearing a black shirt and black fingerless gloves, and she's mid-sentence. But I am going to take us to the Public Theater's website so that we can see what they did for this show, or really what Jess and Tourette's Hero did. Okay, so we have the page for the performance here, and the first thing we see is a promotional video for the show. And I'm not going to play it, but you can see even in the screen cap of the video that it is captioned. So already doing great. If we scroll down to production details, this is where they really get in depth about what folks can expect from the production. So it says performed in English and American Sign Language. It says all performances are relaxed. This means that if you tick, shout, or move about, you're more than welcome. You can choose where you sit, stand, or lie down. You can go in and out of the show when you want. And the great thing is everyone can benefit from a relaxed performance. They They go on to write a lot more about the accessibility of the venue. But what I really want to show you guys today are the different documents, the different pre-show materials that they linked to on their website. The first of which is this pre-show info document. And so this was essentially a visual story that Tourette's Hero created for this show. And it describes in very plain language what the show is, who's doing it, how long it's going to be, and then it breaks the performance into parts and includes pictures of each part. I'm not going to read out loud this entire document, but again, I've linked it in the resource document that I'm sharing with you all, so you'll be able to look at it on your own time. But it goes through and it describes everything that a person can expect from every single part of the performance. And it includes, for example, right here, it says Jess will laugh loudly twice and scream twice. So that's an example of a content note of letting folks know that there are loud sounds that will be happening at a certain part of the performance. And I just think this is so great. What is not included in this document is anything about accessing the venue or purchasing tickets or anything like that. And that's because this production was performed in a number of different venues. And so this was Tourette's Hero's visual story, specifically about the performance itself. But if I can get the Zoom menu to move out of my way so I can close this tab, I can click on the visual guide that Brick made specifically to fill in that gap. So this was, even though it was a under the radar thing, it was performed at Brick. And so they made their own visual guide for visiting Brick. And again, obviously this is an in-person performance. So for a virtual performance, this is going to look a little bit different, but all that's going to look different is you're going to replace these photos of the venue that they've included with screenshots of the various steps of the process of accessing whatever platform you are using. So again, this is written in very plain language. It includes lots of images, and it takes people through how to get to Brick, what to do once they get there, what they can expect from attending the performance. Two other things I want to show you all about this production is that they also created an audio flyer for the show. And again, if we want to think about information, that part of accessibility, this is a way of providing information about the show in an alternate format. And so this is just a recording of Jess essentially reading out the information that was also provided in the program that everybody got about the show. And I'll just play about 20 seconds of this so that you all can get a sense of what goes into this.
Not I by Samuel Beckett. Biscuit. Tourette's Hero brings a fresh perspective to a Beckett classic, Biscuit. Friday, 10th of January to Sunday, 19th of January, 2020. Biscuit. 7:30 p.m., Monday to Saturday.
All right. It goes on. I think it's really cool and a really great and creative way to think about providing information about your show in an accessible format. And the last thing I want to show you guys, it's something I've never seen before. I think it's just incredibly cool, is that they created a sonic story for this production. And what this is, it's a graphic that shows from house open to house close, a timeline of the performance in sound waves, so that anybody attending the performance who wanted this information could see what parts of the performance are the loudest, what parts are the quietest, so that they could adequately prepare themselves however they needed to. Oops, didn't mean to zoom in. For what was coming. So this is certainly not something standard, but it's something that I think is incredibly cool. And again, a way to really be creative when you're thinking about access. All right, so I'm going to go back to my presentation. And I know I have a couple of questions in the chat if I can get the Zoom window to pop up. Okay, question from Rebecca in the chat. What are the most accessible ways to actually make the visual story accessible? Email generally, or should we be thinking about other ways? That is a really, really great question. I think that something that's important about accessibility is to make that information available in as many different places as possible. So I would link the visual story on the web page for the production as they did for Not I, and I would also include it in, ticket confirmation emails and any reminder emails that folks are getting about the performance. You want to just make sure that folks have multiple points of entry to that document. And then in terms of like the format of the document itself, PDF or Word, both can be accessible. You just want to make sure that you've added alt text to all of the images, which sometimes can be easier to do in Word if you don't have Adobe PDF, which is what you need to make PDFs accessible. But both file formats are relatively accessible. Any other questions after I just showed that about pre-show accessibility? All right, Magali, I see you in the chat.
I will ask it out loud. My typing is not as fast as my talking. I wanted to know how, it was wonderful what Brick provided. How common is that to have the venue or a virtual venue providing that kind of information for us to share with our audiences regarding how to access the platform, how to use the platform? Or is that just a rarity?
It is not common, and that's sort of why I'm so glad I have so many of you here in this workshop today, so I can really encourage you guys strongly to make that happen with your own productions. Of course, when you're doing virtual performances, there certainly are not any virtual platforms that I'm aware of that provide a guide of this nature. So that would be something that you would have to create yourself. And again, that's just a matter of someone taking the time to take a bunch of screenshots and format them in a Word document with some explanation. But yeah, at this point, it's not very common. It should be more common. Yeah, so I hope you all go away from this workshop doing that for your productions. Question from Akia. Question about examples of how the recorded/sound postcard is shared out or used in promotions other than the show website. Love this idea of providing different versions of descriptions, etc. Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I would say the same thing in terms of yes, on the website, also in email communications, include it in your digital program. What's really cool about that sort of sonic story that they made is because it's like a cool looking graphic. It's something you could also, post on your social media or have available in any of those other more visual formats. Same with the audio flyer. That's something you could also have available on social media or something like that. Yeah, that's what I'll say about that, Akia. If you need more clarification, let me know.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, question from Chris. When you're using alt text of a screenshot that has a person in it, should you describe the person as well as what the screenshot is of? Is there a too long alt text description? To answer your second question first, yes, there is a too long alt text description. When you're writing alt text, you want to convey the most important information. So whatever information you want somebody looking at that image to get, you should put that same information in the alt text. So for example, if I was trying to teach somebody how to use Zoom, and I took a screenshot of my Zoom window with a a circle around the chat button because I wanted to show people where they could access the chat. My alt text for that, even if there are like people's videos on the screen, my alt text for that would probably be a Zoom window with the chat button circled located in the bottom right of the window or something like that. You wouldn't need to be like, and there are 5 people on the screen and, you know, this woman has brown hair and this person's wearing a blue shirt. Like that information is not necessary for somebody to get the information that they need from that image. Great. Any other questions? All right, so it's time for a break. So on my screen, I've got images of 3 different people all standing in front of their computer desks and stretching in different ways. And that is what I want to encourage all of us to do for the next, let's say, 5 minutes. We'll come back at 3:01. So I am going to stop screen sharing. I'm gonna play some music and we can just turn our cameras off and hang out and come back at 3:01. All right. Hang on. I can't, okay. Can you all see the presentation? Great, okay. So now we're gonna spend the rest of today talking about all different types of accommodations that you might offer at your actual performances. And the first one that we're going to talk about is the one that is the most common, which is captioning. So there is a lot to talk about when we're talking about captioning. And so let's get into it. So the first sort of distinction that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about captioning is the distinction between open captioning versus closed captioning. I'm sure you've heard these terms before. You may or may not actually know what the difference is between the two of them. So open captioning is burned onto the video file. So that means that it's always visible and cannot be turned on or off by the viewer. Versus closed captioning, which is what we have today and what you're probably used to seeing on Netflix and YouTube and most platforms, is where the captions exist separate from the video or the stream, and they can be turned on or off by each individual viewer. So again, that's what we have today. You can click the CC button to turn captions on if you want, or you can leave them off, whichever you prefer. Those are closed captions. Oops, too far. So when might we use open versus closed captions? So open captioning is useful, for example, if you're streaming pre-recorded video from one platform to another. So let's say you have a recording of a performance that you are streaming live at a certain time for people to tune in to watch. But you're streaming it on YouTube Live and they don't have captioning on YouTube Live. What you could do is you could open caption that video that you're streaming, meaning burning captions into that video so that when you stream it to YouTube Live, people see those captions. That's one example of how you might use it for a performance. But honestly, open captioning is most commonly used and best for social media posts. So for example, if you've scrolled through Facebook or Instagram or really any social media and you scroll through with your sound off, you're still able to watch videos because they're captioned. Those are open captions most of the time. A lot of social media platforms don't have great captioning in platforms, so you usually have to just caption the video and upload it yourself. Closed captioning, as I said, is supported on most major platforms, and it can be used both for pre-recorded and live content. So in general, when we're talking about captioning our virtual performances, 98% of the time, what we're talking about is closed captioning. But let's talk a little bit more about the differences between pre-recorded and live content and how that affects how you're captioning. So if you want to caption pre-recorded content, you have a video, a recording of a performance that you want people to access. If you want to add closed captions to that video, as in, you're going to upload the video to YouTube and you want to have captions there. As I mentioned briefly earlier, YouTube's subtitling interface is quite user-friendly and really easy to use. And it's honestly what I use to caption videos, even if that video isn't ultimately going to end up on YouTube. It's a great way to just create caption files yourself. So you can upload a video to YouTube, and there'll be a button that says add subtitles, and you can do that, and you can just type in your own captions manually if you want to. Or what you can do is have YouTube first generate an auto caption file, which is not going to be accurate, but it'll give you a good starting point. And then you can go in and edit those auto captions to make them accurate. And then you have a caption file with that took relatively little labor to produce and took no money. If you want to do open captions for videos that you're posting on social media or anything like that, there is a service called Capwing that you can use that is free for up to 7 minutes of video content at a time. And then there are paid options for more than that. That again is a really user-friendly interface for adding captions, open captions to your videos. Those are both free options for the most part. But beyond that, there are also tons of paid services out there for you to send your pre-recorded videos to people and pay them to caption those videos for you. There are too many for me to spend time today listing all of them. But again, I'm going to send a resource that will list a number of different agencies that you can reach out to for captioning your pre-recorded videos. For captioning live content, human-generated captions are best. So hiring a person to live type the captions while the event is happening is the best thing you can do. Some platforms like Zoom, as we're seeing right now, do have built-in AI or automated captions for live things, and you could use those too. And there are a number of paid services, both for automated captions and for human-generated captions that you can use. But let's really dive into what the bulk of this is, which is the difference between human-generated versus automated captions. So automated captions are more inaccurate than human-generated captions. That's just the reality of where technology is right now. We don't yet have a computer who can understand what humans are saying better than other humans can. And so that means that automated captions are often not suitable. They're not actually accessible for deaf audiences. That doesn't mean they're not accessible for anybody. Otherwise, we wouldn't be using them at all or using them today. For someone like me who's neurodivergent and who struggles a lot with focus and auditory processing, automated captions are a great supplement for me to help access events. For folks who maybe are hard of hearing, and so just again sort of need a little bit of a supplement. For folks who are English language learners, there are a lot of different ways in which automated captions can be accessible. But in general, I would not recommend them for public events, for actual like public facing performances where anybody in the world can purchase a ticket, because you don't know who's coming. You don't know who is going to need more than just automated captions. And you want to make sure that you're providing the best access you can so that people who need human generated captions have that option. You can use automated captions for something like this workshop today. We're using automated captions today because this is a closed event. We know everyone who's going to be in attendance. And because of that, we know that people had the opportunity to request human generated captions if they need them, but in general, because it's a closed event, we don't need to provide human generated captions if we know that no one coming needs them. So that's the sort of difference there and when you might use one or the other. Human generated captions, you might also hear called CART captions, and CART stands for Communication Access Real-Time Translation. There's technically there are some CART is something specific, and then like human generated captions is like the sort of overarching umbrella that includes CART. For now, we don't need to get into the nuances of different types of real-time captioning. We're just going to call it CART or human generated for today. And as I said, CART is the most accurate option, and therefore it is the most accessible option. So of course it's accessible to folks who are deaf, but it is then also accessible to all of those folks who I said also benefit from automated captions. How much do they cost? Automated captions, there are services you can find that do automated captioning for free. If it's free, it's probably not very good, though, is what I'm going to say. So you might have to shell out a little bit of money. And just to describe what's on my slide, I've got my little price tags up again. And for automated, it says $0 to $20 a month. And it depends on the service that you go with. Obviously, Zoom Pro has automated captioning now integrated into it. And so if you have a monthly Zoom Pro subscription, however much that costs, I think it's around $13 a month, includes automated captioning now. But there are other services. Rev is a common one that costs $20 a month. Otter is my personal favorite, and that with their nonprofit discount costs $10 a month. So another thing to look into. But if you're using Zoom Pro's automated captions, as you've maybe been able to see today, are quite accurate. I was pretty impressed when they released this and saw how accurate their captions were. YouTube auto captions, as I alluded to before, are absolutely not accurate. I don't know what AI they're using, but it does a terrible job. So please do not rely on YouTube auto captions for any of your content. CART captioning is more expensive. It's the most expensive thing that we're talking about today. And that is because CART, like captioning in real time, is a really hard skill. And people deserve to be paid a good amount of money to do it. So it's going to run you probably about $100 to $150 an hour, depending on who you hire. That said, and again, referencing the resource page, I'll include more information about this, but Art New York has a micro grant available to all of you as Art New York members that can help offset the cost of you hiring any access professionals that you might be hiring for your productions, including CART captioners. A couple of other things to note about CART, especially now that everybody is digital and people are starting to understand more and more that captioning is something important to include. CART captioners are in quite high demand these days. And so you really want to try to hire at least 1 month in advance, really as far in advance as you can. Try to get somebody confirmed. Art New York has definitely run into this issue of waiting weeks and weeks to get a captioner confirmed. And so it's great that so many people across the country are captioning their events, but it does mean that you need to be proactive in hiring. And when you hire a captioner, if you're doing sort of a straightforward play that has a script, you must provide them with that script. And that is going to make their job a million times easier and also make your captions that much more accurate, because they'll, provided your actors remember their lines, the captioner will just be pulling straight from the script to create their captions. If you don't have a script, if it's devised or improv or something like that, at the very least, provide them with as much advance information as you possibly can, especially names of characters or proper nouns, anything that the captioner is going to need to know how to spell that's not sort of like a typical word that they would know. You want to make sure that they know that that's coming. But I think that's pretty much it in terms of the differences between those two things. And one more really, really important thing to keep in mind is to specify the type of captioning in your marketing. So again, as I said before, that like cart captioning is not, I mean, automated captioning is not accessible to everybody. You know, I know a number of deaf folks who refer to them as auto captions because it's just not, it's not access. And so it can be frustrating to show up to an event that says it's captioned only to find out that it's actually auto captioned and that's not accessible for you. So I have a sample language up here on the screen. It just says, this event features automated captioning provided by Zoom. ASL interpretation and real-time captioning are available by request. So again, just including simple sentence like that. And then, you know, if you're saying things are available by request, include who they should contact about making that request. And include this information again on your website, in your emails, and all of those pre-show materials that we talked about earlier. And I am going to pause here for questions. I see some stuff in the chat. Melissa is sharing, Veed is a great free resource for adding captions to videos. Free version leaves a small watermark on your video. Very cool. I did not know about Veed. I'm going to write that down. I will look into it and include it in the resources that I send out to everybody. Thank you, Melissa, for sharing that. Magali asks, can you recommend affordable providers of CART? Yes. So again, I'll include a small list in my resource sheet, but who I will recommend right now off the bat is an agency called Caption Access. And that is the agency that Art New York uses when we do CART captioning for our events. They're a deaf-owned company. So of course, it's always great to support the community that you're serving, but also their rates, especially their nonprofit rates, are quite affordable. It typically runs, I think it's about $115 an hour, which is pretty good. And they've provided excellent service every time that I've used them. Rates for fiscally sponsored, that is a great question that I don't know the answer to. I think you'd have to ask them directly about that, Magali. Yes, I will drop the link for them in the chat if it's okay. Once I exit my presentation and we get to the open Q&A, because I can't handle all of that at once. Travis asks, how do you set up automated captions on Zoom? So it's very easy. If you have a Zoom Pro account, you're first going to want to log into your Zoom account on your browser, like go to the actual Zoom website and log into your account to make sure that you have this setting turned on for captioning. So you go to your Zoom account, you go to like the settings tab. And I think you have to scroll to advanced settings and you'll just find a checkbox that says like live transcription for meetings or something like that. You're just going to want to make sure that that is checked off. Thank you, Kyra, for sharing the Caption Access website in the chat. Sorry, I get easily distracted. Yeah, so once you have that setting turned on in your Zoom account, you're gonna, then when you start a Zoom meeting from your account, you will see as the host, the CC button on your bottom Zoom window. When you click on it, you'll have an option that says enable live transcription, and you just click that and the captions are on, they've started. And that's all that you need to do. It's very user-friendly. Chris asks, are there caption companies that are better suited for musical performances versus straight plays? And yes, so to my knowledge, there's really only one live captioning company that specifies in theater, and that is the Caption Coalition, run by David Chu. Again, they're called C2 Caption Coalition, and I again have included their information in the resource guide. But yeah, they specifically do theatrical captioning. Obviously, pre-pandemic they did captioning for live theater, and now they're doing it virtually. But if you're doing a straight play, contracting with any captioning company should be fine. But yeah, if you're talking about a musical, you might want to talk to David Chu and see what he says. Other questions about captioning? All right, moving right along. If anything comes up, you can ask it at any time. But we are going to talk about a different accommodation now, and that is ASL interpretation. So I want to preface this by saying that ASL interpretation for virtual theater is very new. Of course, we've only been in this world for less than a year, and it can honestly be quite challenging for both interpreters and for deaf audiences. ASL really relies on 3D space, and it can be very hard to make it sort of coherent in terms of like a theater piece, and it's just a lot going on that's much harder to understand in 2D space. That doesn't mean it can't happen at all. It just means that not just any piece of virtual theater can be interpreted. You really need to be intentional about the pieces that you're choosing to interpret. And we'll talk more about some sample scenarios and what you might want to think about. As a basic rule, the more complex the event, the more interpreters you need. That's just how it goes. The more people you've got, the more different things you've got going on, the more interpreters you're going to need to capture all of that. So a term that is helpful to know is a dazzle, or a director of artistic sign language. And a dazzle is somebody who works on a production where there is a deaf actor or a deaf character to ensure that person's signing is clear, and that everything is working with that actor. Versus a deaf advisor, who is a deaf professional who you would hire on a production to support the interpreters and to make sure that their interpretation of the show is accurate. Those two terms are very new and mutable. Those aren't like really hard and fast definitions. People are still sort of like figuring out what this new burgeoning field of deaf advising is. But just so you know that in addition to hiring interpreters, you're probably going to also have this other person on your team to help support that. Just like captioners, you must provide the interpreters with the script / as much advanced information as possible. And that is so that the interpreters have something to rehearse with. You're thinking of them a little bit more like actors, in that they need, they're going to take the script, they're going to, see the lines of the character that they're interpreting for, and they're going to rehearse with the script. And additionally, they're going to rehearse at rehearsals. So you're going to need to hire interpreters far enough in advance that they can attend and be paid for some of your rehearsals, so that they can practice signing along with the actors and make sure that they can see visually what is going on with the show. You also should not just be like going out into the world and hiring interpreters on your own for a theatrical performance. You should be working with hands-on. And Beth is here today. Beth Prevor is the executive director of Hands-On. She also works very closely with Art New York on our access programming. So if you have questions today that I can't answer, I'm going to call on her to chime in. But yes, pretty much everything that I am sharing with you all, I've learned from her. So if I'm saying anything wrong, Beth, please correct me.
You're doing good.
Great, thank you. And again, I do have my little price tag icon on the screen here. I'm sorry to say it's not very helpful this time. It says varies on it. And that is because it just is unfortunately the case that there are so many different factors that play into what interpreters' fees might be for a production that it's very, it's going to be very individualized based on your needs and what your production is, that it's hard for me to quote you any sort of price that will be accurate. But Beth, if you have anything to add to that, let me know.
Just quickly, and I guess this is like, I'll do a little quick plug. So tomorrow we are going to be talking about a production that we actually interpreted, captioned, and audio described at the Public Theater called The Line. So I just put the link in the chat. So anybody who'd like to attend, it's tomorrow at 10:30. But you can get an idea of seeing virtually what interpreting looks like, what captioning looks like, and what audio description sounds like in a virtual production.
Thank you, Beth. That's super helpful. And I was actually going to talk about The Line in just a little bit, because I'm going to get into some different scenarios of what ASL interpretation could look like depending on the different types of shows that you might be doing. So the easiest type of production to interpret is a one-person show. So on the screen right now, I've just got an icon of one person with two arrows pointing away from them. The arrows say recorded and live on them, and they're both pointing to interpreter icons. So whether you're doing a recording of a one-person show or a live one-person show, you really only need one interpreter. In the case of a recorded show, what you would probably do is just you would record your actor doing the show. You would send that recording to the interpreter along with the script. The interpreter would record themselves interpreting the show. They would send you back that video. You would put them together. Voila, you have an interpreted performance. If the show is live, again, you probably only just need one interpreter. And I want to qualify that by saying that this is the only, like the case of a one-person show is the only time where a live event only needs one interpreter. If you're doing any other sort of like live event that's not scripted, whether that's a performance or like a panel or anything like that, you need at least two interpreters. Interpreters typically work in teams of two because interpreting live is exhausting. You know, trying to hear the English and translate that into ASL in your head and then do the signing. It's really hard, and doing that for an extended period of time is not really possible. So interpreters usually work in teams so they can switch out every 20 minutes or so. For a one-person show that's scripted, you really only need one interpreter because, again, think of the interpreter like an actor. They've already had the script. They've been able to rehearse their interpretation. They're not really like on the spot interpreting unless your actor does some wild improvisation or something. So this is the one case where I say it's okay to hire just one interpreter. Okay, moving on from one-person shows, we've got small cast shows. So this is, we're talking about 2 to 4 people. And the layout of my slide here is the same as the last one, except I've got the icons of 3 different people on the screen instead of just one. So again, whether you're doing a recorded or a live production, for a cast of 2 to 4 people, you're gonna want 2 to 4 interpreters. And that, ideally, if you can do one interpreter per character, like that is the best option. But it can also get a little overwhelming if you've got, say, 4 people on screen and 4 interpreters at the same time. So in that case, if you got a 4-person show, you could potentially, depending on the structure of the play, again, this is all very individualized, but you could maybe get away with having 2 interpreters with each of them, you know, doing 2 characters. But it really depends, and you should work with hands-on. Beth, I see that your hand is raised.
Yeah, the only one thing I want to say, and something that you just said before, which is the perfect thing, is intentionality. I think that nothing that we're talking about with interpreting is set in stone. Everything depends. So I think that when you're thinking about adding interpreters, you should look at what it is you're adding interpreters to, your audience, and how to do it, and have conversations before you kind of go ahead, because everything always depends.
Yes, thank you, Beth. And so the last type of show we're going to talk about is a large cast show. And in the case of ASL interpretation, we're really talking about anything more than 5 people. So I've got icons of 7 different people on the screen here. But really, I would highly not recommend doing a live interpreted show with a cast of this size. It just would be way too much going on. However, depending on the structure of the show, it could work as a recording, again, ideally with 1 interpreter per character. And this is where I want to talk a little bit about The Line, which is the show that Beth and Hands On did with the public. I did not intend on this workshop featuring so many shows from the public. There are other organizations also doing great access work, but this is just what we've got. So The Line was a show that the public did last year about frontline workers, and the way that the show is structured, characters didn't actually interact with each other. It was, from my understanding, like a series of monologues from different characters that were sort of intercut with each other. And so what the public did was they recorded all of those, they had those actors, the videos of those actors performing that they sent to a team of interpreters. They had 1 interpreter per character. Those interpreters recorded themselves interpreting each of those parts. The videos got put together, and there you have it. You have a large cast performance with interpreters for each character. But again, that only worked because there weren't, 7 people on screen at the same time. So if you're doing a show that is similar to that, where you only have a few people on screen at a time, it could work. But again, intentionality is super, super important. So I'm going to pause here and open it up for questions about ASL interpretation, if folks have any. All right, we will move along. Oh, go ahead.
So in live events that I've attended in the past that had ASL interpreters, they were usually close to the wing and shit was spotlighted and didn't take attention away from the performance. So if you're using Zoom as a performance platform, there's not much flexibility for altering the size of boxes and so on and so forth. And if we're speaking about accessibility, is there another platform that you would recommend for us to use to provide virtual theater that has ASL interpreters that allows you the flexibility of changing the size of the image so that the audience can focus on both the action and the ASL, so that it's a mixed audience can enjoy the performance? Does that make sense?
That absolutely makes sense. A couple of things. One is, again, if you're doing a performance that has sort of fewer actors, then I think doing it on a platform like Zoom, where all of the videos are the same size, would still be okay. I've attended an interpreted performance on Zoom that was structured that way, and it was maybe like a few too many characters, unfortunately. But if they had just cut it down a little bit, it would have been great. But if you want to have a different option where you can change the video sizes, the only platform that I know that does that is a platform called StreamYard that I believe gives you the option to be really to really customize what your video looks like. And so StreamYard is like a back end platform that you would then stream to YouTube or Facebook Live or Twitch or some streaming platform.
That wouldn't be in conjunction with Zoom. That would be separate from Zoom.
Yeah, you would not use Zoom at all in that case. So I believe you could, StreamYard, yes, StreamYard does have a max of 10 people on screen. But again, if you're doing an interpreted performance, you should not have more than 10 people on screen. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know quite as much about how StreamYard actually works on the back end. I haven't used it. I've only seen it used for performances. But that is, from my understanding, the most customizable streaming platform that currently exists. Yeah. Okay, so Melissa asks, how many interpreted performances do you recommend during a run? And I'm going to pass that question to Beth. What do you think?
Are you talking about a live run, like in person?
Hi, sorry, this is Melissa. I was thinking about live run, but then also it could be for Zoom since we're still in that realm.
I mean, for live runs, we have generally done 1 or 2 performances, and usually we do it at different times. So we would do an evening performance and a matinee of a show. On Zoom, I mean, honestly, because we really haven't done as many, the production that we did of The Line, they had a separate platform specifically that was the ASL version of the show. So it was up for the length of the run. It was there, but it was on a separate YouTube channel. Like how the public did it, they developed an open caption version, an audio described version, and an interpreted version, and each one had its own YouTube platform. So it was available for the whole time.
Thank you, Beth. And great question, Melissa. Akia says in the chat, Zoom has recently updated so that you can move around the boxes of people and screens. I don't know how, but apparently there is now a way in the new updates. Yes, that is true. So if you have the most recently updated version of Zoom, I'm not sure if it works while someone is screen sharing, so you might not be able to try it now, but you should be able to like click and drag people's boxes to move them wherever you want, like in the order of the gallery view on your screen. But that doesn't allow for resizing of videos, which I think is what Magali is asking about.
In terms of the size too, you really don't want an interpreter to be too small. It would be really hard for a deaf person to read. And I also think the updated Zoom, you can actually spotlight more than one person at a time as well, which is helpful for interpreting.
Yes. All right, any other questions? All right, so these next few things that we're talking about as we sort of go on in this presentation, we're getting to accommodations that are less and less tested in the virtual space and that are going to be a little bit more speculative, but that means you have more opportunity to get creative. So the next thing we're going to talk about is audio description. And audio description was very rare in New York theater in normal times. For whatever reason, it was very common in regional theater in other parts of the country, but New York did not really do it. And now that we're virtual, it's basically non-existent. But so what are we talking about when we're talking about audio description? The first definition I have on my slide is the sort of traditional definition of theatrical audio description, which is hiring a professional during a performance to verbally describe on-screen visuals that are important to the story. And I've got my little price tag on here that again says varies, because like ASL interpretation, there's just so many different factors that go into hiring an audio describer that, again, it's hard to provide you a quote without knowing more about your specific situation. But beyond that sort of traditional audio description, there's also what we've been doing today, which is describing yourself when introducing yourself and describing, visuals during a presentation or a talk back, anything like that. And the price tag for this says $0 because it is totally free. And so even if you don't incorporate full audio description into your performances, I hope that you take this practice of self-description with you into the future. But let's talk a bit more about audio description for live versus recorded productions. So for something that's live, audio description needs to be run through a separate stream. And that is because platforms like Zoom don't allow for multiple streams of audio to be coming in at the same time. For example, if you've ever heard multiple people on Zoom try to talk at the same time, it doesn't work because Zoom will only allow one of those people to be heard. And that's great because it means that there's not like crazy noise happening all the time, but it unfortunately means that audio description doesn't work because you need that simultaneous stream of audio. So you would need to do similar to what the line did, where you have a separate stream for that's specifically audio described. And Disability Unite is a platform that I've linked here that offers this, that basically allows you to set up a YouTube stream that lives natively on their website. And you can have a sort of a regular stream, an audio described stream, an ASL interpreted stream, whatever you need. And they use YouTube as their actual streaming platform. For recorded productions, the audio description can be edited onto the existing video file. So what you would probably do is hire an audio describer, send them your recorded production or whatever it is. They would record themselves describing that and edit the recording onto the video file, and then send it back to you. And then you've got this described file. And so again, with the line, you would then just offer a second link to the audio described version. Both of these are examples of taking a play that already exists and just sort of putting audio description on top of it. But as this is so untested and as we are all thinking about access and how we can be creative with our access, I encourage you all to think about what it might look like to incorporate audio description into your production from the onset so that it's not something that you have to edit onto separately and offer a second link for it, that it can just be part of what the play is from the beginning. So I'll just throw that little nugget out there for something for you all to think about for the future. Moving along from audio description, we've got relaxed performances. And so on my screen, I've got a picture of a person sitting on the ground in front of their laptop. They're wearing a cozy sweater, their hair's tied back, and they're holding a bowl of oatmeal or something like that. And beneath that picture, it says, watching theater from home is already a relaxed environment. And so you might have heard relaxed performances also called sensory-friendly performances. Those terms are essentially interchangeable. And you might have also heard the term autism-friendly performance, which is a slightly different thing. That's a specific program through TDF, and we're not going to talk about that today. But with in-person theater, when you're making a relaxed performance, that typically involves things like keeping the house lights up, dimming light and sound cues, and allowing people to move freely about the auditorium. And as it says on my slide, what's great about virtual theater is that watching theater from home is already a relaxed environment. Folks already have the ability to move around and do what they need. They can adjust their own computer volume and brightness and all of that. So that is already taken care of for you, which means that what goes into making a relaxed performance virtually is really the pre-show materials that we already talked about. So having a visual story is key to this, having content notes. Again, going back to information and participation, what you want to do, what's really important, especially for neurodivergent audiences, which is who relaxed performances are designed for, is that folks have all of the information that they need to know about the performance before the performance happens. So you want to be clear about how people can access and participate in the event. And you can convey that information through a number of formats, as we've talked about. And choice is really, really key. So if possible, have asynchronous viewing options, which means not just only being able to tune into the performance at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday. And if you can't watch it at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday, then you're done. I understand that sometimes that's what it is. And especially given like union things, like maybe that's all you can do. But if you have the possibility to have a recording of your performance or to have a multi-show run of a performance that can be available for a longer amount of time, that's going to be more accessible because folks can watch it in the way that works best for them. And again, if you're doing sort of a straightforward show, there aren't really participation options. People are just tuning in and watching. But if it's anything more interactive, make sure that you have a variety of participation methods. So like we have today, people can ask questions out loud or in the chat, utilize those Zoom nonverbal reactions, whatever, again, creative things you can come up with about allowing people to participate in their own ways. And I have my little price tag on the screen here again, and it says $0 on it because, again, none of this costs any money for you to implement. It just costs a little bit of extra time and creative thinking. I see we have some stuff in the chat. Can you give an example of a production that has used auditory description? I wish I could. Besides The Line, I truly don't know of very many productions that have done this. And that's what I'm saying, like these last few things that we're talking about today are mostly untested. If you want to see samples of audio description, a lot of like TV streaming is starting to do audio description, especially Netflix. A lot, especially like the newer like Netflix original shows, pretty much all have audio description. I know from folks who I've talked to who are blind or low vision that Stranger Things has especially wonderful audio description. So if you want to get an example of what audio description looks like, watch an episode of Stranger Things with audio description turned on, and that'll give you a sample. Yes, and Magali says in the chat that Real Abilities Film Festival uses audio description. And yes, in general, audio description is used much more frequently in film and TV than it is in theater. Okay. And Sonako asks, what is the option if you want to provide captions in 2 languages? So in that case, you would, again, have to provide sort of 2 different streams or 2 different recordings, depending on if it's live or recorded. So you would be like, click here for the performance captioned in English, click here for the performance captioned in Japanese. Or whatever you're doing, but it would have to be 2 separate things. Unfortunately, no platform is as sophisticated as Netflix is, for example, where you have that whole list of languages you can choose from when you're turning your captions on. Zoe asks, if you are using a pre-recorded platform like Vimeo, you can add multiple language subtitle files. Oh, great. That's something I didn't know. I should have read that before I gave my answer.
Yeah, sorry, Kristen, I'll
so
just chime in.
go
Sorry.
for
Yeah,
it.
I was just saying that you can add, those are closed captions, so you can't burn it in, obviously, but you can add multiple languages, like up to 5 or 6, I don't know, if you're using something like Vimeo. And I think YouTube does that as well.
Yes, YouTube does do that. You're 100% right. Thank you for that, Zoe. Yes, but if you are doing something live, as far as I know, you've got to do separate streams. Beth, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to kind of say again, if people are available tomorrow morning at 10:30, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to show examples of the line. And I think that might be helpful in kind of taking all this incredible information that Kirsten is saying and seeing it in a theater platform. Because what the public did was it was sign interpreted, captioned, audio described, in written Spanish and Mandarin. So they actually had 5 different kind of platforms going in terms of access. And Rich Denny, who is the director of audience services, will kind of talk about how they did all those individual platforms. So it'll show you an example, which I think kind of like reinforces what things look like with these different accessibility components.
Yes, thank you for that, Beth. Definitely encourage people to go to that. Again, this is just so infrequently done that there are not so many examples out there to show you all. And the line is not publicly available anymore. So if you want to see it, the only way to do that is by going to this workshop tomorrow. Oops. All right, well, I just changed the slide. So why don't we move on to the next topic, the last topic for today, which is touch tours, with touch in quotation marks. So this, like audio description, was virtually sorry, got distracted by the chat. Virtually non-existent in New York theater, very common in regional theater. And nobody, to my knowledge, has been doing any version of touch tours in the virtual space. So this is really just like my ideas and like things that I hope can spark your creativity when you're thinking about how to provide access. So the ultimate goal of a touch tour is to provide visual information about the show in another format. So they're originally designed for blind and low vision audiences. They're also helpful, again, for folks who are neurodivergent or anybody who wants advanced information about a show before the performance. So in-person touch tours typically involved inviting audience members on a tour of the set so that they could get a sort of spatial awareness of the set. They could touch certain set or prop pieces, certain costume pieces, and they would also get introduced to all the actors in character so that they could recognize the actors' voices before the show. How do we translate something like this to the virtual world? One way you could do that is sort of having a pre-show Zoom where actors can introduce themselves in character and describe any important props, costumes, other visuals. And something that I've seen some TYA or Theater for Young Audiences shows do in this virtual time is send sort of little themed goodie bags to their audiences in advance that contain certain tactile things that are important to the show. Obviously, that is like generally more relevant to kids shows where being tactile might be part of the experience, but you could think creatively depending on the show you're doing about if there's something that you wanted to send to people to get them a little bit more immersed in the experience. So my price tag on here says low cost. It really depends on what you're doing. You might have to, if you're doing this pre-show Zoom, you might need to pay your actors for an extra half hour of their time or whatever that might be. But, again, this is really untested and an opportunity for you to be creative and think about the information part of accessibility and what new ways can we impart information to people about our performances. All right, but that is really it. I just want to leave you all with some key takeaways before we leave a few minutes at the end for final questions. The first of which is be creative. And I have an image of a paint palette here. Especially, as we've talked about these last few things like relaxed performances and touch tours, there aren't really any rules. And you can really, again, think about information and participation and how you can creatively provide information to your audience and provide various opportunities for participation to your audience. With that being said, be creative while listening to expert users. And for this one, I've got a little icon of two people sitting at a table smiling. One of them has a laptop open. And, you know, people with disabilities, a lot of folks with disabilities, especially in the theater field, love to talk about this stuff and love to talk about what they need and love to talk about access. And there are experts out there who you can talk to get more insight on what might work or not work about your performances. And I'm always available as a resource at Art New York to either ask me questions, and if I don't know the answer, I can connect you to folks who do. So please use the community of disabled folks around you as you're developing your accessible programming. And finally, with an image of a clock, I have take your time. So I am not expecting any of you to walk away from this workshop and immediately implement every single one of the accessible programs that I've talked about today. Again, as we talked about with ASL interpretation, like be intentional. That is really the key. I hope you can pick one or two of these things to start with and really dedicate yourself to making them work well, and know that that is going to take a little bit of time. Obviously, some of the things are quicker than others. Like you can turn automated captioning on your Zoom account on tomorrow, and then you have that. But some of these things will take a little bit more time. And once more, I just want to remind us of information and participation. At the end of the day, this is what accessibility boils down to. It's making sure that everybody has the information they need and can participate in whatever way that they need. And that is all for the presentation. I know we only have about 5 minutes left, but I'm going to stop screen sharing and we can just talk a little bit more if you have any last questions. And I do have a question in my private chat that are these accessibility practices mandatory or preferred or choice? What a question. So, of course, as a disabled person, I want to say that they are mandatory. And technically, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, it is legally required for you to make things accessible. That being said, that is not a law that is frequently enforced and is only enforceable through lawsuits. So if you are not accessible, you run the risk of getting sued. But suing people takes a lot of money, and a lot of disabled people don't have the money to do that. So I want to highly encourage you to be as accessible as you can. But I would say, especially some of the more creative stuff that we talked about towards the end is certainly not legally required of you. It's just a great thing to do. That's my answer to that question. Anything else?
The event, the project that's featured in the event tomorrow at 10 a.m., someone had a question whether it's available for viewing other than them.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up, Magali. Beth, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the line is available to be seen anymore at all.
I'm only going to say not yet. So the hope is that eventually they're trying to get it put back up, but right now it's not.
Great. All right. Well, you all have my email, and you will get a follow-up email from me tomorrow with a document of resources as well as an evaluation form, which I again want to highly encourage you to fill out. Thank you all for joining me today, and please, I'm always available to answer questions. I love answering questions, so email me anytime. I'm happy to talk through stuff as you're working on making your performances more accessible. Have a good rest of your Wednesday, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Kristen. You're great.
Thank you, everybody.